So very good morning, everyone. It is, after this kind introduction, it is my great pleasure to share with you the next 2 hours where we're going to tackle the fascinating topic of regulatory on medical devices. Before we start directly with the core of the subject, please allow me just to make a quick presentation about Medidee. Medidee is a company which is a consulting services. So we help medical device manufacturers to go through the different challenges related to quality assurance, regulatory affair, clinical affair. So the idea is really to help manufacturers to implement the necessary activity, perform the necessary action to ensure compliance, to be able to place their device on the market. A few years ago, we started to have a fourth domain, which we call digital health. The idea was really to start to have a focus on the different technologies which were related to digital health and to be able to adapt the different processes and to identify what was the compliance pathway in order to ensure that software as medical devices and medical devices which are embedding software were also able to reach a level of compliance which was adequate. In our team, we have people dedicated to the digital health. In the next 2 days, or those 3 days for the workshop, we will be the three of us to present different topics. So I will start today with the presentation and the general introduction of what is a medical device, what is the regulatory context, what is to be taken care of when we develop a medical device. Tomorrow, my colleague Gustavo Hernandez will actually present you the key aspect related to cybersecurity. So Gustavo has a PhD in communication technologies and system. He actually studies at the Polytechnical University in Madrid, and he also worked as a software engineer before joining Medidee, so he has a very good understanding of the implementation of software. And on the Thursday, the last day of the training, my colleague Stamatia Pagulatu will actually present you the challenges related to artificial intelligence and machine learning. She had the chance to basically use machine learning in her research in the laboratory of hemodynamics and cardiovascular technologies in the EPFL in Lausanne. So she will have practical example and insight on the challenges related to machine learning. One thing which is very important is that at the end of the third day, we will provide you with a quiz. If you want to receive a certificate of attendance and if you want to receive the slide at the end of the 3 days, you will have to complete the quiz. So I hope you will be able to go through the whole presentation. During the presentation, you can also ask questions if you have any questions. So you can type the question and I will try to handle them directly. And if I cannot handle them directly, I will take them anyway at the end of the presentation. What we are going to discuss today, or what are my objective for our call or our discussion today, or the presentation, the idea is really to give you an overview of what is the regulatory framework for medical device in the European Union. You'll see, I will include Switzerland in the European Union. I know it's not something we should do, but this is from a regulatory purpose, we're going to do it. We're also going to look at the specific requirement related to software within the medical device regulation. Although, as you will see, medical software are medical devices as others, there is particular requirement we have to take into consideration. And the idea is to have an overview of what are those requirements. And we also, at the end of the presentation, discuss a few of the specific requirements, or more precisely, how you should actually address the different requirements pertaining to medical devices. So I like to start this presentation, or the presentation of my presentation, with this slide, because I think Eucomed produced a very interesting slide here, because what we see is that medical devices are actually affecting all of us during our life. So depending on our fortune or infortune, we may have different interaction with medical devices. Anyway, I mean, even before we are born, we already are interacting with medical devices, because I mean, we have imaging systems that are basically looking at the babies, how they develop, and so on and so forth. So we're already exposed to medical devices. And then depending on what will happen, we will more or less be in contact with medical devices. And it's very likely that the last device you will be connected to before your very last day will be a medical device. So what we see is that medical devices are extremely diverse, extremely various, and you are interacting with medical device more or less all of your time. So at the end of the day, it is necessary that we have an appropriate context framework for the medical devices to be sure that they're safe, that they're operating as expected, and that we can basically rely on the function of this system. And regulatory activities at the end of the day, this is what it is about, to ensure that the device is safe and that the device is performing as expected. Now, when we look at medical devices, it's if you look at the evolution of the technology and practices around medical devices, we have a very interesting evolution. I mean, if you go in the past, maybe let's say 150 years ago, 100 years ago, you would mainly depend on the doctor or whatever the field of the doctor, and this doctor would actually have tools, eventually develop some tools himself or herself, and then use these tools. So you would basically rely completely on the expertise, on the experience, on the knowledge of the doctor to basically operate and deliver the care that you're expecting. So of course, the level of control and the level of validation was fairly limited. And basically you were having a one-to-one relation with your doctor, and you were simply expecting that the doctor was, let's say, able to deliver what it was supposed to deliver. What we see nowadays, of course, things have changed quite a lot. I mean, once you go now in an operating theater, if you go in a hospital, and if you go in a surgical room, you will see that actually the surrounding of a surgical intervention or any medical care in general is extremely automatized. We use many medical devices. We use diagnostic devices in order to detect pathology, in order to diagnostic pathology, to measure multiple parameters. And we see that more and more of those devices are actually animated by software or are software by themselves. Interestingly, when we look at the evolution of medical devices, you can typically now see that you may have robots, which are basically surgical robots, which are now able to do procedure almost by themselves, or let's say by themselves. So what we see is that in the future, we will have more and more connected care. We'll have more and more system which will be able to provide care automatically without eventually even the interaction of the doctor himself or herself. So of course, those devices needs to be developed in a way which is enabling safe and device which are performing exactly as expected. As I mentioned in the introduction, medical devices is a world of diversity. And when you're tackling medical devices, it's very important to know precisely what is the medical devices you're looking at. The WHO consider there is about 1 million different type of devices. So I never really understood how they structure this counting. But anyway, they really, when you consider medical devices, I mean, it can goes from surgical gloves to automated robotic devices. It can goes for implant, like hip implants. You can go to pacemakers, which are active implantable medical devices. So you see that you have multiple type of devices, and understanding what is the device, what is the mode of operation of the device will help to understand what is the regulatory framework which apply for the device. So we typically have one framework which is related to the medical device, which is, let's say, the general devices that you see here on the left-hand side. And you have another dimension which became quite popular thanks to this COVID situation. We have the in vitro diagnostic device. So the typical example of an IVD is this COVID test that probably most of you have taken at some point, where you basically are able to make a diagnostic or make a measure from a physiological parameters or from any kind of sample where you're going to assess whether there is a characteristic or not. And this in vitro diagnostic devices are also medical devices, but as we will see a little bit later, they're regulated under their own legal framework, which is quite similar to the medical device, but still having its particularity. Other devices in vitro diagnostic, I mean, we typically see those devices to measure blood for glucose, or you typically have a pregnancy test will be considered as IVD. So, and all those devices are also animated or may be interacting with another type of devices, which are the software. Software are interesting devices in themselves because you may have software as standalone software. So basically you have a software which is installed on your computer, which is installed on the platform in your smartphone. And this is basically a standalone system that is operating by itself. Or you may have software which are embedded in the different system. So historically, you typically have the firmware in the first place. So when we're starting to talk about active devices, like pacemaker, like robotic system, like any others, you would have the firmware or you would have the embedded software that will enable the system to operate. And now more and more, we do have software which actually are connected to this device or which are used in the standalone mode to either identify specific cares, either to perform diagnostic, either to process results, or to provide information and guidance on diagnostic. Now, if we look at the definition of the medical device, the definition of the medical device is something that you will find. So it's something which is well established, which is actually in the Article 2 of the Medical Device Regulation. I'll come to that a little bit after. So the Medical Device Regulation is providing the overall framework on medical device. You need to look carefully at the definition and at every word of the definition. So here I made a simplified definition of the medical device. If we look at it, it means any instrument, reagent, material, or software that is used on human being. So this is something which is really important. The medical device is to be used on medical being. And it's, let's say, mainly used for diagnosis and treatment of a disease, injury, or disability. So the idea is that you really have a clinical purpose associated with a device, and the device is really defined to be used within the frame of handling a disease, handling the consequences of an injury or a disability. If your device is actually doing something different than that, let's say you're using a device to measure your performance while you're doing sports, or you're using your device to help on health wellness style, then it will not be considered as medical device because you need to ensure that this object is used to actually provide a clinical benefit. Another characteristic which is extremely important is that the medical device, to be a medical device, shall not achieve its principal intended action, so basically what it does, by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means. What does it mean? It means that typically if you're taking, if you having, let's say, an item, an object that is actually modifying the biological interaction or the way, typically through pharmacological means, then at the end it will be considered as a pharmaceutical device and not as a medical device. What is quite interesting in that field is that we have the whole world of what we call borderline medical device, and borderline medical device are device that can be classified eventually in one category or another category depending on the device. And when you look at software, what is really important to take into consideration in terms of the definition, maybe you will consider your software as a non-medical device because in the first place, you have developed your software to do a specific action, to support the user to, I don't know, manage some data or to actually be able to calculate some parameters and so on and so forth. And then the way this software is going to interact with the other object will actually influence its own classification. So typically, if you're using, let's say, a medical device and you're using that as a companion device, I don't know, with a pharmaceutical treatment, then the classification of the device will be different if you use the very same device, the very same software with another device, which is classified as a medical device. So it's very important to basically look at your own system that you have defined and to see how this device works. What is the principal intended action? So how does it work? What is the principal purpose? And based on this, you will be able to define how you have to consider your device. If we look at some example of what is a medical device to start with, we have here the example typically, the notion of stethoscope. You have incision drape, you have syringe or infusion pumps, wound dressing, stents, urinary catheters, and so on and so forth. And what you typically have here are devices which can be used in different devices. If I look one question here that I'm going to use, I'm just going to answer. So we have one question for Henrik, which is quite interesting here. So typically how this relates to the term of combination products. Let me see if I can answer that. So the question that was related is how does this relate to the term combination product? So a combination product is typically a device that is that is part of the two world. And you typically have, for instance, a drug-eluting stent will be a combination device. Why? Because the stent is basically a tube that you're going to insert in arteries in order to be able to perform a surgical procedure, and you're going to apply some coating, which might be a medical, which might be a pharmaceutical, so a drug, and the drug will typically be used to prevent that the blood coagulate during the procedure around the tube. The notion of combination device is actually that you have to take into consideration multiple regulatory frameworks. So in my case of my drug-eluting stent, I have a medical device. Then I have to consider the medical device aspect. And then I have a drug which is used in combination. And then I have to look in terms of how the drug is regulated. Now, you need to decide or you need to make a choice. I mean, your device needs to be regulated by one regulatory framework in the first place. So what you will look is what is the principal mode of action. So in the case of my drug-eluting stent, the principal mode of action of the device is actually used by the tube, whereas the drug which is used to prevent coagulation will be what we call an ancillary action. So it's actually supporting the main operation. So when you have combination device, it's typically when you have a component on your system, on your product, which is regulated by different framework. And then you need to consider what framework are to be taken into consideration and basically how you will apply them. Julia is asking another question that I will try to share. No. Julia is asking another question, which is basically, so prevention tool used by healthy people will not fall under this classification. This is another interesting question because sometimes we have this mistake. So we have a regulation which is called protective equipment, for instance. So these are typically devices which are used by healthy people, basically to protect themselves. We can take a very simple example, is the right season. If you think of going to ski, you will actually wear a helmet. The helmet will actually be used for prevention of an accident. So in that case, the device is not going to be considered to a medical device. Nonetheless, it is right if we go in the detail of the definition in the article 2 of the medical device regulation, you will actually see the notion of prevention. And here it's a very interesting question to look at, because the notion of prevention is typically if you prevent a disease. So let's take, for example, a condom. I believe this device is known by all of you. So if you use a device, if you use a condom, actually you use a condom in terms of prevention. So you're basically preventing the transmission of a disease. So it's typically you may have devices which will be used in terms of prevention, but actually you need to look at what is the clinical use. So if you have healthy people having sex and using a condom, then they are using a medical device. But if you have healthy people going to ski and they wear a helmet, they're not using a medical device. They're eventually wearing a protective equipment. We here have typical example of of objects which are not medical devices. Sometimes we have a confusion around those devices. So typically the baby nappies or the toothbrush, sometimes the toothbrush are considered medical device. They are not, unless if they have particular clinical claim. But I mean, most of the time, toothbrush will be considered as cosmetic product. Wrinkle treatment. So typically, we know when you're if you're applying cream in order to prevent or to treat, or hopefully to treat wrinkle, actually those won't be considered as medical devices because I mean, fighting the effect of age is not a disease. So the fact that we all getting older every day is not a disease. It's just a matter of life, and this is not something that we can treat. The mask for protection of user, for instance, typically it goes in the protective equipment. If we look typically other devices which can be interesting, like sunglasses or eye protective visor, they're not considered as devices, but in some case it might be a little bit different. If we look, for instance, sunglasses, if you just buy sunglasses, they won't be medical devices as long as they don't have corrective glass. But if you do have corrective glass, and then this feature is actually providing a clinical benefit, which is correcting the vision acuity or reinforcing the vision acuity. And those sunglasses will be considered as medical device. If we look at the mask for protection, very interesting for those who are interested. We had this pandemic. So the pandemic was clearly a terrible situation for a lot of people, but from a regulatory perspective, it brought a lot of very interesting questions. So typically, we have plenty of masks for protection that were used. So there was a lot of question about the quality of the mask for protection. Very interestingly, if you look at mask for protection, which are not necessarily surgical masks, so typically if you have FFP2 mask, for instance, in the first place, very often those masks are used in the building industry, and you don't necessarily have medical devices, you have protective equipment. And nowadays, we're mainly using surgical masks. So surgical masks are typically masks that are being used in surgical procedure in order to prevent the transmission from those wearing the mask, the contamination to the patient. So at the end, those devices have a clinical intent or a clinical purpose because they are preventing that there is the transmission of pathogens. So of course, if you go and buy masks in the shop, you should actually look on the packaging and look if you have a little CE mark, and look internally if you have a declaration of conformity that is mentioning that it's a medical device. So this is something that you probably want to ensure when you buy such devices. The example also of wrinkle treatment is fairly interesting because in the first place, as I mentioned, treating wrinkle is not a medical purpose. I mean, just addressing a fact of life. But it would be fair to say, well, I mean, we know that all those fillers that are being injected to patients are considered as medical devices. And the idea behind is also another very interesting idea is that in the first place, those devices were considered to be used for surgical reconstruction. And surgical reconstruction, typically for patients having AIDS or other pathology, would actually be a medical purpose. Whereas we're not really treating any more wrinkles at that stage. But of course, over time, those devices have been classified as medical device. And now, if you come with a new filler, it is very likely it will be considered as a medical device, if not having, of course, a pharmaceutical impact. Why are breast implant considered to be a medical device? So this is a question that is being asked by Jocelyn. So indeed, breast implants are considered as medical device because in the first place, well, I don't know if it's in the first place because I don't know the detail of the history of breast implant, but in the first place, here it's the same as wrinkle treatment. The first breast implant were actually used for surgical reconstruction. So typically, if you think of young ladies having breast cancer, where they would have to go to, I think it's called a vasectomy or something like this. Basically, you would actually remove all the, let's say, the affected tissue in the breast, and then you would use breast implant to actually reconstruct the body of the patient. And in that principle, you actually handling the consequences of a disease, because I mean, you first have a cancer, you have the impact of the cancer, you have to remove the tissue, and then you're basically providing the patient with a way to be back, if I can say so, in its original shape. I have another question from Sylvia that we can take here as well, which is basically, what about devices, apps that help enhancing the therapy? For example, it reminds me to take a pill. So this is a very interesting question because it opens a lot of questions. So some devices which are going to enhance adherence to therapy, in most cases, they won't be considered as medical devices. Because I mean, handling therapy adherence in most of the case. So if the function of your device is only basically reminding you, so if you have an app on your phone that is basically sending you alarms to say, oh, it's a time to take your treatment or something like this, this is just a nice calendar. It's not necessarily a medical device. Nonetheless, if you start to look at this device or this software, very often you have additional function that will actually start to monitor the way you are taking your treatment, and eventually those systems may actually make you recommendation and so on and so forth. So as you will see later in terms of classification, as soon as you have specific action on the data, it may be considered as medical devices. So if you're working on device or software which are helping reinforcing adherence to therapy, then you need to look very carefully at the function of your system and check function by function if it's a medical device or not. Medical devices are operated, or they are organized in classification, and that is something which is fundamental to understand and to follow, because the classification, it's called originally a risk-based classification, which is hard through because it's not only based on risk, but historically that was really to organize the device in type of risk. So basically, if you go at the lower classification, the class 1 for medical device or the class A for IVD, those devices are the devices which in theory have the less risk to the patient. On the other hand, if you go for class 3 medical devices or class D for IVD, you have the device which have the highest risk. Why it's useful to know and to follow up on this information quite carefully? Simply because the classification will basically define the level of scrutiny, hence the level of effort you have to do for compliance. If you have a class 1 or class A, you have, let's say, limited conformity assessment process. So basically, if you're the manufacturer for class 1 or class A, you have to comply with every point of the regulation for sure, but you don't need the involvement of what we call the notified body. We look at this just after. A notified body is a third party that is basically participating to the assessment of conformity, and it's actually putting your product and your company under a kind of surveillance. If you have a class 3, then you need to have the support of this notified body or the interaction with notified body, and also you need to bring much more data and information on the clinical side. So if you look at the type of classification, we can basically divide the world in two categories, let's put it that way. In the medical device, you have class 1 and class 2A, which are lower risk device, and you have class 2B and class 3, which are high risk device. So if you end up working on a class 3 medical device, it's very good to know, because it means that the level of effort you will have to do to demonstrate safety and efficacy is likely to be much higher. We have an interesting question here from Kanika. Is the Apple Watch that measure vital a class 1 medical device? It's an interesting question in the sense that I've been looking quite carefully to find the regulatory documentation by Apple, and it's not so simple to really find the way they organize and classify the information. It's much more easier in the US. But please keep in mind that the regulatory framework in the US is very similar, but not the same. So you have differences in the US and in Europe. Nonetheless, the app, the SEG app and the SPO2 app, which are embedded in the Apple Watch, are actually medical device class 2A. They're not class 1, they are class 2A. Hence, Apple is very likely to have worked with a notified body in order to be able to place their device on the market. If we have just a look on the evolution of the healthcare throughout the first century, so let's take a curve where we have the level of involvement of IT on the vertical axis. We have the time on the horizontal axis, and we have, let's say, the line of time, which is exponential, because it seems to using exponential is something very up to date. If we look at this line and we start to position the type of hospital at the beginning of the century, or even up to the mid-50s, or even a little bit later, you would have what we call traditional hospital. The traditional hospital is basically what we had in the first image with the tools, which were basically hospital, which was a place where you would have doctor using devices more or less controlled with regard to safety and performance. So at the end of the day, in those traditional hospitals, we would rely on the competence of the doctors, and we would also not have any support with IT. We would have paper file, we would have diagnostics documented in forms, and so on and so forth. So we would be quite limited in terms of IT dependency and use of IT. In the 70s, 80s, we started to have what we call the digital hospital. So we started to have devices which were bringing advanced function, typically in the imaging field and different field, where you would start to use software to basically be able to operate the devices. So we would have more and more system eventually connected with each other. You would have the starts of the computers, let's say the personal computer, where you would be able to handle files. You would have mainframe system that would be able to establish calculation, but it was still a house, a large house, a big house with doctors and some computers, or let's say active system here and there, which were basically used to manage care. Starting from the 80s and after, we started to have what we start to call the smart hospital. The smart hospital is basically a system, or let's say it's an organization which starts to depend very much on the IT, because over time the system will have been connected with each other. The system will have been enhanced. The capacity for calculation start to grow bigger. We start to store data. We would start to be able to have patient data file. We would start to be able to make analysis, and we would be able to start to interconnect the different information. So typically, if you look now at the university hospital, whether in Zurich, Geneva, or others, you have the patient file. In the patient file, you collect information from all sorts of devices within the system, within the hospital. So if you go for a surgery, you have feedback directly from the devices which are transferring data in the patient file. If you go in the patient file, you have tools to make some analysis, diagnosis, follow-up, etc. So this notion of smart hospital is really leveraging within the hospital the capacity to interconnect the different systems in order to generate additional care, more efficient care, basically to leverage new capabilities and possibilities. We are now moving quite rapidly to another dimension, which is the connected care. So the Apple Watch, which was mentioned before by Kanika, is a good example, where we start to be connected as human beings. So we have devices monitoring how we sleep. We have devices which are not medical device when you sleep, unless if you make a claim for insomnia. You start to have a medical device on your phone. You start to have medical device on your wrist that is measuring the way you act, the way you run, the effort you do, how your heart is beating, and so on and so forth. And those information can be automatically transferred to other systems that will actually preempt some situation and basically start to monitor you. Very interestingly, I have a friend telling me once wearing one of those smartwatch that it was basically woken up during the night by the watch, telling him that it was basically starting a fibrillation. So he has a cardiac arrest in the middle of the night, and basically he was awakened by the watch. So we start to see that we have devices onboarded, and those devices are connected with each other. So now when you take your phone, you start to connect your device to other devices, and so on and so forth. So we start to have a kind of constellation of device. Of course, it opens plenty of questions about data protection, but this is not necessarily a topic that we'll address here, but it's something you always have to keep in mind, because what we see, even though we're not extremely good in Switzerland with data protection in practice so far, it is a topic that is evolving very rapidly as well. What we have here, I mean, if we look at this technological evolution, it provided fantastic new capabilities. For instance, what we see is that typically we have now the notion of telemedicine, remote medicine is something that came really into place. Here again, the pandemic enabled really change in the dynamic. I mean, before the pandemic, the use of telemedicine or remote medicine was mainly used for specific type of cares or specific situation, but it was quite, let's say, complicated to go to your doctor and say that you would like to use telemedicine because you don't necessarily want to come to meet with the doctor. With the pandemic and the transmission of the virus, suddenly the doctors started to like very much telemedicine, so that way they could be able not to see the patient in their cabinet and to protect themselves. So it helped. But what also was very interesting, if you look what happened in Italy, for instance, Italy was the first country to suffer from the pandemic in a very dramatic situation. And they were completely overwhelmed, mainly in terms of hospital capacity. So they were extremely creative to be able to start to monitor patients remotely. So basically, they were having patients coming in, they were treated, and as soon as possible, they needed to get them out, but they still needed to monitor them. So they're starting to equip some of the patients with devices, SpO2 devices, typically cardiac devices, and so on and so forth. And we're starting to ask people at home to start to take the measure to try to connect these devices to be able to follow up on the situation of the patient. So interestingly, this pandemic also changed some of the dynamic typically with regard to digital health. Precision medicine is another fantastic area. If you think in terms of 10 years ago, when you would talk about lung cancer, for instance, we would tell you, look, you have a lung cancer and that's it. Nowadays, when you are diagnosed with lung cancer, it's still a bad news, very bad news, but you start to have the type of cancer that you have. And knowing the type of cancer enable you to have a specific treatment because you do have treatments which react or not to specific indicator. So this notion of precision medicine start to enable to have really specific treatment depending on the particular condition of the patient. And what we see now typically with next generation sequencing, so basically you take the genetic, you make the sequencing of a sample to identify, for instance, genetic variants, unable to identify specific pathology or rare disease that you would not be able to identify before. So the capacity here of this evolution is very interesting in what they bring. Mobile health as well. Of course, as I mentioned, you're connected and you have this more or less everywhere. Now you have access, you have the possibility to have access to healthcare system more or less anywhere. When we look in terms of part of the challenges, what we also see is that we have an increase of complexity. We have development of algorithm, complex algorithm. We have learning algorithm that start, machine learning algorithm that start to come into place. So those are also complex system, which add another layer of complexity to the classical software, if I can call it that way. We start to also have the, let's say, the loss of native infrastructure, in the sense that we start to use the cloud in order to store data. I mean, nowadays it's even safer to store your data in the cloud than to store them locally, because it's likely that the cloud operator is establishing all technical means to ensure data are available or safe and so on and so forth. And we of course have the interconnectivity. I mean, you have an app which is communicating with a software somewhere, with a server somewhere, etc. All this situation brings also new constraint. We see that we have a very rapid evolution of the product. I mean, those software are designed to evolve rapidly. We have new channel of distribution that disrupt quite the market. So typically, being able to supply your medical device on the Google App Store, on the App Store, is something which is to some extent quite new. And consequently, also what we have is that we have a lot of patients that becomes doctors by themselves. I mean, I don't know how many virolog specialists in biology we have today. Again, thanks to the pandemic. I mean, everybody has his own opinion about what is the virus, how they transmit it, and so on and so forth. And this we can see also in other field of treating patients, is that when patients come to the doctor, they are connected with their own system. They have been monitoring themselves. They know, and they have more expertise. So it's also interesting in the empowerment of patients to be able to work on that. But of course, it's a constraint typically for the medical field that they have to take into consideration. This brings also very interesting challenges in the software evolution. I mean, typically in the software, we know that we want to release multiple release per year. So, I mean, we have the product which is evolving rapidly. This might be a complexity, or that might be a problem with regard to regulation and regulatory aspect. Well, sometimes we do have problem with the software, so we need to fix bugs. So we need to inform the competent authority eventually. So how do we handle that? How do I distribute my software? I mean, how do I ensure that my software is delivered to the right people, used correctly? So that there is quite some question here. We have the whole dimension of security aspect. Of course, we see a lot of ransomware around. I mean, my colleague Gustavo is going to speak more about that tomorrow, but we see that cybersecurity becomes a real issue. I mean, hospital by themselves are targets, device by themselves are target. Your data as patient are extremely interesting for hackers and for other malicious people. So this is something that you always have to take into consideration, especially if you design a medical device, which is a software. You need to ensure that device is cyber safe. And then there is a question of validation. At the end of the day, you need to be able to demonstrate that your system works as existing. And typically for those of you working on the machine learning field, you see that validating the performance of an algorithm which is based on ML might be quite complicated. And there is still quite some discussion about how we measure the efficacy and how we avoid bias and so on and so forth. And here, my colleague Martina is going to talk a bit more on this the day after tomorrow. So now when we look at the regulatory context, of course, the regulatory context is very broad, very various. You have a lot of documents that have to be taken into consideration. So you have to look, basically, you need to find your way out, and you basically need to see the interconnection between the different aspects. So typically you have the regulation on the top level, you have the European regulation, you have the national regulation, then you have regulation when you do clinical trial, you have regulation when you place your device on the market, you have regulation to handle when you want reimbursement, and so on and so forth. So of course, when you start to tackle this topic, it's very likely that you might be confronted in the situation of this user not really finding the way out for the conformity. One thing that you always have to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, you will always be able to find compliance, because at the end of the day, well, you design your product, and provided that your device is working, if it's not good enough, you can always go back to the lab and test and test and test again. The risk here, and why it's really important to tackle very early the regulatory situation or the regulatory context, is that you want to make it as short as possible, because it takes a lot of time. You need to go through the whole process. It will require quite some effort at the end of the day, and the optimization of your regulatory journey is something which is really strategical, because at the end of the day, if your device is highly regulated and you're not able to demonstrate the safety and performance of your device, you will never be able to place it on the market, or you will be able, but it will take you a huge amount of resources. You also need to be extremely specific on how you plan the activity, because you want to do the activity only once. Very interesting to do a very early clinical trial, but are you really going to capture something new information with your clinical trial that you don't find in the literature? Because that costs a lot of money. Maybe you should wait a little bit and do your clinical trial later in order to validate some of the aspects. On the other hand, you want to go very early in a clinical trial, but with something very basics in terms of function, just to validate the principle of the proof of concept, to be sure that you're following the right way. Same with the regulatory approach. If you're thinking of classification, as we discussed before, if you're handling the wrong classification and you basically put the wrong target, then your journey might be quite difficult and quite long. So really at the start of your project, when you already consider your device, it doesn't mean that you need to implement your quality management system and you need to do everything. What is really important is to establish what we call a regulatory pathway, is to say, okay, this is basically the requirement out of my product. This is how my product is being classified. This is basically the stage that I will go through in order to be able to achieve this objective, which might be the CE mark, maybe 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road. Another dimension that you have to consider when you look at regulatory consideration is the fact that we are evolving now from a situation. If you look at the way we were regulating medical devices in the 90s, of course, we were relying a lot of what we call best practices. So the idea is that not even standards, but the way we would do, you would have clinical guidance and so on and so forth. And basically, if you were able to comply with this approach, we would consider that the device was safe and the level of requirement was not so important. Also in the past, we are mainly looking at safety of medical devices, but the notion of performance was not really well established. So if you have a device safe, we would admit that, well, if the device is safe, it's not going to harm anyone, so we can just let it on the market. For the last 20 years, 15 years, the dynamic has changed quite a lot, especially typically with the scandalous of the breast implant PIP that you may know, that triggered basically the change in regulation and resulted in the new regulatory framework that entered into place last year, the MDR, Medical Device Regulation, that will enter into application this year for the IVDR, where we have much more stringent expectation on the demonstration, not only on safety, but also in terms of performance. And this gentleman that you have on the picture is William Edward Deming, very interesting characters that actually is to some extent considered as a father of quality management. This gentleman is basically the first one, or at least the first one known to have introduced scientific method in terms of evaluating quality. So really implementing processes where we would make quality controls, we would collect data and so on and so forth in order to make conclusion. And this gentleman once said that in God we trust, all other brings data. I will let you make yourself your own opinion for the first part of the sentence, but for the second part of the sentence, this is something which is quite fundamental. The notion of data today, the data in the medical area is the gold today. It's really what you need to be able to process. If you don't have data on your device, you go nowhere. If you do have device, you are able to demonstrate the safety and the performance of your device. So when you're developing your device, when you're thinking on how you're developing your device, always think, how am I going to collect data? How am I going to formalize the data? And how these data are going to support the demonstration of the efficacy of my device. It's really important because that will be the underlying question. The more data, correct and relevant data you have, the better you are in order to go through your regulatory journey. That was for the first part and the first introduction with regard to regulation. Now let's make a deeper dive in this fascinating world of the European legislation. The European legislation is considered as a single market, which was comprised of 28 member states. We still have Switzerland inside that single market, but not for medical device anymore. But I mean, a single market is basically regulated with the principle, the main principle of free movement of goods, not goods, but goods, which is really the cornerstone of the principle. So the idea at the end of the day is that if you have a device, whatever the device, not only medical device, but your computer, your car, your phone, if your device is manufactured in Europe and it's basically, or let's say manufactured in France or in Germany, it has been tested and received a CE mark in Germany, this device has to be able to circulate within the European market. So it's really the idea that we have one big market which share the same requirements with regard to the product. And that's typically what we call the essential requirements. So every domain will be regulated, or not every, but I mean many domains are regulated through a directive or regulation. And you will always find in those regulations those three conditions. So typically the notion of essential requirement. What is your product supposed to do, supposed to be? What are the characteristics the product shall offer in order to be considered adequate to be placed on the market? Then the regulation or the directive is going to define a method that will be established to define how the product is compliant. So basically, how do we demonstrate that the product is in compliance with the essential requirement? We'll see the example after for the medical devices. And then there is always the mechanism to supervise and control the action on the market. So typically to define who is responsible to ensure that the market or the actor on the market are behaving according to what is in the regulation. So what is really interesting in the European market is that this principle apply for everything. So if you take your smartphone and you look on the back of your smartphone, you will see this little CE logo, which is typically the sign that the device is conforming to a given regulation, which will be the regulation on telecom, for instance. You have a regulation for toys, you have a regulation for elevator, and so on and so forth, and you always follow the same principle in order to demonstrate the safety of the product. So basically to demonstrate that the product fulfill the requirement. So once you have understood one of the principle or one of the approach, you basically have understood all of them. The CE mark, as I mentioned, is this little logo that you will find on many devices. You can find it on your car, on the toys of your kids, on the smartphones, on the computer, on the medical device. And at the end, this notion simply indicates that the product is conforming with the established requirement in the European regulation. So it's always the same. When you have an object, you need to understand what is this object, what is the regulatory framework behind this object, mainly a regulation, a directive at the European level. And then you need to go usually in the Annex 1, in the first annex of that regulation, and to look at what we call the essential requirement or general safety and performance requirement. And this document is going to tell you what are the characteristics your product has to fulfill to be placed on the European market. One thing which is really important to keep in mind, the CE mark is not a marketing tool. It's not a nice to have, or it's not something we get for the investor. It's something which is mandatory to have on your device. So you need to go through this process, the conformity evaluation process, to be able to place the CE mark on your device. If you don't have the CE mark, it means you have no business, so you're not able to sell your device. You also have to keep in mind that once you get the CE mark, it's not forever, so you have to maintain your CE mark. So as we'll see a little bit later with the interaction with notified body, you need to perform some action on a continuous basis in order to be able to keep your CE mark. If you lose your CE mark, it means that your device cannot be anymore placed on the market. Another question from Kanika, is this directive also applicable for connected device and app? Yes, exactly. So at the end of the day, if your software is to be considered, or if your device is your connected device, your IoT, Internet of Things devices, is considered as a medical device, as we'll see just after for the qualification, then the medical device regulation or the in vitro diagnostic device regulation will apply on your device or on your app. So yes. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, in the past we were having three regulations, EC 9385 for active implantable medical device, the medical device regulation in the middle, 9242, and the IVD directive 9879. So the first number of the regulation, it's always interesting to see, 90, 93, 98, is basically the regulation, it's the year the regulation has been voted. So you can see that the European framework, before the change that we are just going to present, was a kind of old framework in which we're not really considering software per se. So the changes now is considering much more software, but in the past, in the previous system, on the previous regulatory framework, the notion of software was less taken into consideration. Again, now we have two main regulatory framework, which replaced this previous organization. So we have the 2017-745, which is related to the medical device regulation. So this regulation is providing requirements with regard to every devices, basically implantable, non-implantable, active, non-active devices, which are not in vitro diagnostic device. And these include also specific requirement for software. And you have the IVDR regulation, 2017-746, which regulates specifically diagnostic devices. And this regulation also regulates software, because you may have software that are also in vitro diagnostic or accessory to in vitro diagnostic. So again, when you're looking at your device, you need to consider carefully what is the type of device you have at hand. With those two regulations, so that's basically your starting point. So you will look at the content of the regulation, but it's not sufficient, as we'll see a bit further. You need always to take into consideration the national law, other law at the European level, typically data protection, the general data protection regulation is one regulation that is directly referred from the medical device regulation. So you have to take into consideration eventually new regulation. You'll see in the field of artificial intelligence that there is now a directive, which is a draft at the European level, which is a document that we will have to consider for medical devices as well. You have recommendation from the European Union, you have guidances, you have technical standards, and you also have best practices and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, you have a starting point, which is the regulation, but it's never just one aspect that you have to take into consideration. It's a kind of puzzle of different items. And one of the challenges, of course, to identify all the regulation you want to take into consideration. A question here from Jimmy, will the proposed artificial intelligence regulation have an impact on the MD regulation? Yes, for sure. So if you want, in many cases with the regulation, you not only take into consideration one regulation. The typical example we can say is that, okay, if you have a medical device, it's regulated by the medical device regulation, okay, but this device is handling data protection, is handling data, patient data, sensitive data, then the requirement of the GDPR also apply. It's not one or the other. So you always have to take into consideration all legal requirements. So the directive on artificial intelligence that is actually in draft mode is actually introducing a requirement with regard to machine learning system, and those medical devices which will embark those aspects will have to take into consideration aspect related from this directive. So for those of you working on this field, having a look at the draft is probably a good idea to take that into consideration. Now, the new regulation, and why do I insist on presenting the new regulation since the change operated? It's very important to understand that the new regulation that came into force last year and is entering into force this year really changed the paradigm on how we looked at medical devices. There is a significant, the European Union, the legislator decided to significantly increase the level of scrutiny to basically bring the medical device to the same level as the pharmaceutical product. So the pharmaceutical product, or let's say the medical device, were considered as a little brother, little sister from the pharmaceutical product in terms of regulation. The situation has clearly changed now. The idea from the regulator was to say, well, those medical devices, they need to be at the same level of pharmaceutical product. We are not exactly there yet. I mean, still having pharmaceutical is more complex, requiring more data and so on and so forth. But still, we have made quite some progress. So it's very important also to say, okay, you may find stories or people having a great expertise that was maybe related to their experience 15 years ago. Well, 15 years ago in the medical device regulation is a complete different world as what you have today. So it's important to say, okay, today we are in a world of evidence-based medicine where we need to have evidence, where we have to be able to demonstrate the different claims that we do. And this is really the fundamental underlying principle with this regulation. The notion of regulation, medical device regulation, was interesting because the idea was to try to ensure that we would have the same requirement or the same interpretation of the requirement over every European country. This is a pure fail. That was a good attempt because you have differences in the interpretation between the different countries. So the new regulation fixed some of them and created new ones. So even though normally a European regulation apply exactly the same way to everyone, you always have little differences, and typically in some cases, depending on the nature of your product, it can be interesting to have some awareness about these differences. There was also the notion of catching up with technological innovation. Here again, we might have a fail, interesting progress, but typically when we're looking at artificial intelligence, when you're looking at new technologies, it will be interesting to see how the regulation will evolve. But I mean, low legal process is always behind technological innovation, and I don't think it's really possible to catch up at the end. So there has been some progress, typically with regard to software. A lot of changes have been applied to software, but still probably there are some aspects that are outside of the regulation. So it's always interesting also when you're working on very innovative technology, as it might be the case, it's to consider how much your product has been regulated and how much you're basically pioneering also on the regulatory field. If you're developing a new product with new technology, which is really new from the technological perspective, maybe it will also be quite a challenge on the regulatory aspect. So this is always something to consider. Control of notified body, very important change because the number of notified bodies available have been significantly reduced because all notified body had to go through the designation process, which is basically to demonstrate to the competent authority that they were capable of handling conformity assessment for medical devices. And this has changed quite a lot because requirement has been, and scrutiny over those notified body has significantly increased through this process. Competence, of course, increase of competence. So now typically you have the person responsibility for a regulatory aspect. So typically you have expectation toward medical device manufacturers and other actors on the market that they have appropriate competence to handle the situation. Scientific demonstration, as I mentioned, data is key. Data is what will make you progress with your project. So at the end of the day, first think what your device do, and then think what data you can collect and use to demonstrate efficacy. We also have a notion of transparency and information exchange. So the European Commission established a database which is called EUDAMED, in which medical device manufacturer will have to store information which will be public. So typically the result of clinical investigation, the safety of their device will have to be explained, and so on and so forth. So at the end, we see that there is quite some significant changes in the way we apprehend medical devices. Of course, all those changes are with the idea of safety. European Parliament, European Commission, or politicians in general, I would say, do not want to have further scandal related to medical devices. Typically, this PIP breast implant scandal was really a complicated situation to handle, and they want to avoid this situation. So we have always, with the legal pendulum, we have regulation, deregulation. I mean, if you look at the history of regulation, it's always like this. We regulate, then we change politician, we deregulate, and so on and so forth. In Europe, we are clearly in the way of over-regulating, so we reinforce significantly the regulation, and it might be troubling for those of you starting to look at this, because if you go in the US, they are actually in their deregulation phase. So they have been regulating before us on the software, and now they start to deregulate. So again, if you look at the European situation, if you look at the US situation, you will have some differences, and you cannot just translate one to another one by one. The MDR, very interesting document available for free on the web. So I invite you to go and get it. So you type basically medical device regulation in Google and it will come. You have a lot of information in that document, which is basically structured with the article themselves. So basically all the point of the regulation. And you have the Annex 1, which is really interesting because the Annex 1 is, as I mentioned before, the core requirement your device has to fulfill in order to be placed on the market. So these general safety and performance requirements, I really invite you to go and read them, especially during the winter near to the fire. It's a good setup to really go into detail. You'll see its general principle that you have to address. We'll see some of them just after. But you need to find a way to respond to every single applicable requirement, and there is 123, so there is quite some work. Then you have guidance on how to set up your technical documentation, Annex 1, Annex 2 and 3. You have classification rule, very useful, as we will see after, and then you have the procedure for the conformity assessment. Lastly, something you want to consider, Article Annex 13 gives you the requirement on clinical evaluation. The clinical evaluation is the process of demonstrating the safety and performance of your device. And this is one of the key activity to get your CE mark. So at the end of the day, you need to be sure that you are able to perform such evaluation. There is another question from Sylvia that I'm just going to take now. It seems that also the new EU regulation is not keeping up with technology and digital evolution. Do you know if new guidelines and normative are being planned? The European Union has changed the mode of operation. So the demonstration of conformity is based on technical standards, generally made by the ISO or by the IEC. What they have started to do now, the European Commission, is to start to generate guidances, which are called MDCG, which I don't remember what it's said for, but and those guidance are basically providing information and interpretation on how to apply the regulation. It's a little bit the same as FDA guidance for those who are aware of this from the US FDA. So the principle is really that the European Commission is able to precise and define in more detail some topics of relevance. So I don't have any knowledge if specific guidelines on specific topics. Well, there are guidelines which are actually which are prepared with regards to medical device regulation interpretation. It's also very likely that in the future, the European Union will provide some guidance through these documents about specific technological field when relevant. We typically see in the nanotechnologies, there are some questions related now how we actually, I mean, we have issue with nanotechnology and biocompatibility, for instance, and here we have guidance which are being worked on. I would say as a minimum in terms of your reading, once you have downloaded that document, as I mentioned, read the Annex 1. I think it's always very useful and interesting to go through this Annex 1 and to see what you have in there and basically what is the level of requirement and the nature of the requirement. A quick word on Switzerland. So Switzerland, as you know, is in the center of the European Union, but Swiss have their own way of thinking, obviously, which is not always easy to understand, especially if you're working in the medical field. So basically on May 26, last year, the Swiss Federal Council decided to stop every discussion on the European Framework Agreement. So as you may know, up to, well, we're still interacting with the European Union through agreement, which are called the bilateral, so bilateral 1 and bilateral 2, which is basically a set of agreements that enable mutual recognition. So basically what is being done in Switzerland is recognized in the EU, what is being done in the EU is recognized in Switzerland. So that was extremely practical because we were part of this single market, being able to access different European countries and so on and so forth to do business there. It's still the case for some of the product, but it's not the case anymore with regard to medical devices, because once we change the regulation, when the European Union entered into force with this MDR on May 26, 21, since the Swiss decided not to follow, then the European Union decided that the legal framework from Switzerland was not equivalent anymore to the European framework. So we have a situation which is quite interesting, which is the Swiss recognize the European legislation, because in our regulation, we actually reference directly the European legislation. So it's quite funny if you open the Swiss Ordinance on Medical Device, the MED-O, you actually go in that document and it would tell you directly apply the EU framework. So we basically applied the EU framework in Switzerland with some little exception, but the European Union does not recognize Switzerland. So we are basically considered now as a third country, like would be the Botswana or would be any other country around the world, which is not part of the EU. So it generated a particular situation because we're in the middle of the European Union, but we don't have access the same way to the market. And we are not part of the whole framework related to medical device. So typically we don't have access to EUDAMED. Our competent authority, Swissmedic, is not part anymore of the interaction between the competent authorities and so on and so forth. So at least for the medical device market, it's not a fundamental political opinion here, it's purely practical. From the medical device market perspective, the situation with regard to EU interaction has worsened since that date. What you have to keep in mind here, I mean, the main aspect you have to take in the first place is that when you will market your device in the European Union, if you are a Swiss manufacturer, you will need to have a European representative in the European Union. And if you're actually locating your company in the EU, you will need what we call the Swiss representative in order to be able to place your device on the market. Two questions I take here. One question from Yael: is this situation also applicable for IVD to IVDR? So the question is yes and no. No, because we're still, the IVDR is not entered into force. So we're still part of the European market for the IVD because we are under the previous legislation. But in May 26 this year, the new IVDR will enter into force. And from that date, we will be excluded also for IVDR from the European market. So we will basically regulate both type of devices in the same way. Another question, this is a precious information for medical device development. Are we going to tackle regulation in terms of what stakeholder can and cannot do? I'll try. I'm not sure to understand precisely the question. Maybe you want to refine it. That's what you have done in the other question: pharmacy, hospital, pharma company, private company. Well, if you have more specific question along the way, please ask them. I'll try to address them. It's a bit broad to tackle it without a direct interaction. Sorry, I made a little mistake. The two questions were not, oh no. Another question: can an EU rep also be the company's own branch in the EU state? That's a question from Thorsten. The answer is yes, of course. The EU representative can be a natural person, legal person in the European Union. So if you have a company established in Switzerland and you have a branch or an affiliate in the EU, this company can be your EU rep. That's not a problem. Nonetheless, you still have to take into consideration the requirement that apply to EU rep, but you can clearly have your own entity, and to some extent that would eventually be recommended, because then it's probably a more efficient approach if you have this possibility. In terms of players, we have the manufacturer. So the manufacturer is always the responsible body for the medical device. Whatever happened at the end of the day is the fundamental responsible for the device. So it's basically the entity that placed the product on the market. We have the competent authority. So you have a competent authority in every country. We don't have, like for the pharmaceutical, the EMEA that foresee the market. We have individual competent authorities working together. Their role is not to approve medical devices. Their role is actually to approve clinical trial with medical devices, if you want to do clinical trial, and they have to watch the market to ensure the manufacturers and the notified bodies are behaving according to the requirements. So they're not directly regulating the market in the sense that they're not testing, validating, or giving opinion on devices, but they're making market surveillance. So typically a competent authority can decide to make an inspection at the manufacturer to verify compliance is correctly established. Another player which is really important, the notified body. Notified body is a private organization which is accredited by the member state. So by notified body, we can mention BSR, we can mention WIPSUD, we can mention DNV, we can mention, so there are multiple notified body. And the role of this body is basically to do the conformity assessment. So the idea is that you will meet the notified body with your technical file, and they will review your technical file. They will review your quality management system as well to ensure that you fulfill the requirement, the established requirements. In this conformity assessment, what is actually checked by the notified body? What they are going to look at is typically if you are able to address the famous 123 requirements in the Annex 1. So how do you address those requirements? Is your device clinically safe? So basically, at the end of the day, when we use your device, do we have a positive risk-benefit ratio for the patient? So all the data that you have to sustain this performance and safety of your device will be reviewed in detail. And then there is a formal regulatory aspect that will be checked. So typically the way you label your device, what standard you use, how you make declaration of conformity, and so on and so forth. How does it work in practice? Well, at the end, you need to look in the logic that you have a technical file that you will establish to basically have the overview of all your all the information you have in your file. You will establish a quality management system. So that's how you operate the organization. And once this is in place, you will go to the notified body. They will review what you have in your files, what you have established in your system. And then based on this, they will say, okay, you are in conformity. So it looks that you fulfill all the requirements. And based on this, you will be able to draw the declaration of conformity. So basically, you will be able to affix this little logo on your device. You have special cases, class 1 medical device and class A IVD. You don't need a notified body. It is considered that you will make your self-assessment and you will make a self-certification or self-declaration. And basically the rule here is that you have to notify the competent authority of your country when you place such a device on the European market. Interestingly, what we can see with software in the new regulation, so what we can see is that in the past, we didn't have any classification. All software were considered as active devices. We didn't really have fundamental requirement, only one which was related to software. And we mainly had one harmonized standard, so one technical standard that was mainly referenced. And the MDR, we actually have much more characteristics. So software has really been embedded in the regulation. We have one specific classification rule, we'll see after. We have specific definition, notion of compatibility, interoperability. We have in those 123 requirements, we have 6 of them which are specifically related to software. So you want to have a look at them. And we also have a requirement for technical documentation and clinical evaluation, also related for software. And finally, we have references to data protection, which is something that we have to take into consideration. Some example of those requirements that we find in the regulation. So typically 14.2, reduce as far as possible the risk associated with the possible negative interaction between software and IT environment, which it operates and interacts. So when you place a software within, let's say within an hospital, to take an example, you need to ensure that this software is actually interacting not negatively with the other system. So you can consider it in terms of cybersecurity, you can consider it in terms of interaction with data and so on and so forth. Another requirement, in the event of a single fault condition, appropriate means shall be adopted to eliminate or reduce as far as possible consequence risk of impairment of performance. So typically you need to consider not only for software here, but you need to consider typically if your device is making a single fault condition, so the primary fault with your device, what are the consequences and how do you handle them? For devices that incorporate software or for software that are devices in themselves, the software shall be developed and manufactured in accordance with the state of the art, taking into account the principle of development lifecycle, risk management, including information security, verification, and validation. So when you design your software, you need to specify and you need to be clear what will be the requirement that you will apply. We will see a little bit later how do you consider the state of the art and what is actually defining the state of the art within medical devices. To continue, some requirement related to mobile platforms. So it's something which is also quite important. So if you have a device that is intended to be used in combination with mobile computing platform, so it can be all kind of mobile computing platforms, iPad, tablets, system in the cloud, etc. Then you have to consider the specific characteristic of this mobile environment. 17.4 is actually bringing specific requirements related to IT security. So we see that the cyber safety of devices has been formally introduced. So that's the main requirement. So you see it's quite general. Now you need to define how do you ensure that your device is cyber safe. That's basically the expectation out of this requirement. And the regulation, as I mentioned, introduced a specific classification at the time, which was the rule 11. So the rule 11 is basically helping you to define what is the class of your software. So I will read it with you. So software intended to provide information which is used to take decision with diagnostic therapeutic purpose is classified as a class 2A. So it's already interesting to stop here because any medical device or any software that is providing information which is used to take decision is already a class 2A, meaning that you need to have the involvement and a notified body. So that's already a start. And then when you see that this device may have or may cause death or irreversible deterioration of a person's state of health, then it's a class 3. higher class, or if a serious deterioration of personal health or surgical intervention is needed to fix the situation, basically you have a class 2B. So interestingly, when you have a software that is intended to provide information, you already classified as 2A, eventually up to class 3. And then when you have software which are classified, which are intended to monitor physiological process, they're classified as class 2A, except if the intended for monitoring a vital physiological parameter where the nature variation of those parameters and such, it could result in immediate danger to the patient, in which case it's a class 2B. So typically if you're monitoring heartbeat or let's say blood pressure of a patient remotely at home, so just for let's say follow up on the health, that would be a class 2A. But if you're using that in a situation where you're taking decision, for instance, in the surgical theater, then it will be a class 2B. And then you have the notion of all other software are classified as class 1. Interestingly, you need to see also if your device is not accessory to another software. So for instance, you may say, well, my device is not maybe providing any information and it's not being used to monitor physiological process. Okay, so what is this device doing? What is this software doing? It's very likely it's interacting with another medical device. It's being used in support or to drive a medical device. And then it will actually not be classified as a class 1, but there is a classification rule that says that it falls in the same classes. So again, the structure of the product is quite important. If you have a standalone software, then you are able to look at these classification rules and you will see how your device is classified. If you have not a standalone software, so software used with other devices, then you may end up having, you need to look at the classification of the other product. So in terms of take-home message here, what is it? Well, with the MDR and the IVDR, the regulators is willing to increase the control significantly. So it is a regulated market, highly regulated market. So there are expectations to be fulfilled when you place your device on the market. And the software, we also start to have specific consideration with regard to software, because at the end of the day, it's not considered just as an active device. We also want to take into consideration risk associated with software. And we also have additional requirements that goes on top of general requirements for medical devices. Lastly, also cybersecurity is a key point. Second last point I wanted to share with you, some aspect related to what is software as medical device. Of course, we always have the question when we're confronted to a software to say, okay, is my software a medical device or is it not a medical device? So this is an open question. Maybe we can take a little example here to see how the audience would respond. So let's say I have a medical device, let's say I have a software, which is a system which is basically used to track fertility in women. And the idea is to identify when is the fertility window in order to conceive or to avoid a conception of baby. So basically, this app is going to tell you whether it is a medical device. It is going to tell you whether you can have unprotected intercourse with regards to having kids or to prevent to have kids. So it's at the end providing you information of your fertility level. Would you consider that as a medical device or not? Normally, you should see a little poll. How would you vote on this device? So we can see the poll. Interesting. Let's see when we have the audience where we go. The no is coming. The no is getting back. We have a lot of yes, but no. So it is a medical device. It is a class 2B medical device because interestingly, the fact of conceiving a baby is not considered as a medical condition. It's not considered as a disease. So the fact that if you use this device to conceive a baby, you need to find the right timing to basically be able to conceive. It's not going to be considered as a medical device. But if you use that to prevent to have a baby, that will be considered as a medical device. Interestingly, there is a specific classification rule that I didn't show that is part of the medical device regulation, which states that devices which are used to prevent conception are going to be considered as medical device. This case is really interesting, and that's the reason why it's here. You can look at it on the web because there has been an article on the regulatory status, but that's one of the first devices that structured the way we regulated software and apps in Europe, because this device is actually part of the borderline manual. So years ago in 2013, 2014, the competent authority had to take a decision on how they would actually regulate this device. And at the time, there was not a consensus on how this device would be regulated. So here we typically have an app which is working on a smartphone, which is a class 2B medical device. The software as medical device can appear in many forms. So you can have them as a medical device like a firmware. They can be an accessory to a medical device, so they work along with another device. They can be standalone software, so they're simply installed on your computers, or they can be apps. We have plenty of medical devices which are apps now, and you can also have web app. So typically they're just running on a server. You go on either on an app that is emulating or integrating a web app, or you go in your browser and you actually have an app online. And those might be a medical device. So the nature and the form of the software is not making it a device or not. It's more what it does that makes it a device. And that's why what is always interesting and essential to look at is what we call the intent use. And the intent use is basically what is the purpose of the app, which is defined by the manufacturers. And that's always this intent purpose that has to be taken into consideration to decide if your application, your software is a medical device or not. To guide you in this decision, you actually have a guidance, MDCG 2019-11, that is available for free on the web. That's provided by the European Commission. And in that document, interesting to read, by the way, you have the way to interpret whether your software is a medical device or not. And basically, you have a decision tree which provide the following question. Is the software incorporated as in a medical device, like a firmware? In that case, yes, it's a medical device. Second question, very important, is the software performing an action on data different from storage, archival, lossless compression, communication, or simple search? If you answer yes to this question, it is likely to be a medical device. Then you have to look if the action is for the benefit of an individual patient. So am I processing this data for the benefit of this patient? If the answer is yes, it's likely to be a medical device. And then the question, of course, is, are we in the medical field? So is the action for the purpose of diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, or living of disease, investigation of physiological process? So basically, am I treating data for this patient in the field of a clinical purpose? If the answer is yes to the question, then you're very likely to have a medical device. If you look at it in another way, if you describe your document, if you describe your software, and your software is actually amplifying, making analysis, calculating, controlling, correlating, supporting within the field of a medical, of a clinical area, then again, it's likely you end up having a medical device at hand. Example of medical devices that you will find as software. Typically, if you have patient data management systems, so patient file that have specific function to control allergies or to actually calculate the posology of pharmaceutical compounds and so on and so forth, it's likely that it will be a medical device or part of it. Clinical decision support system are very often considered as medical device. So typically dosing system will be a good example. Application that you will have on your phone or in different framework, like application that will enable you to assess if a beauty spot is considered as malinous or not, that will be considered as medical device. ECG, interpretation of ECG, and so on and so forth are very often considered as medical device. Question here is just a question for comparison. PACS is actually, I'm just going to show this question. Yeah, so the PACS is actually the system that are used in hospital that are originally used to store images from imaging system. So typically imaging from MRI and so on and so forth. And those systems are quite interesting because very often they start to embed function. Typically, if you have, I don't know, an image of a tumor or something like this, then you will end up having the measuring function will actually be considered as a medical device. There is quite some question coming into these. What I suggest, since the time is running, I'm going to go through the last slide. I have about a little bit more, and then I will go back to the different question, if that's okay with you. Question with regard to the last topic I wanted to address was the pathway to conformity. So basically what you have to take into consideration when you are looking for conformity. As you have understood by now, the main approach is to be able to ensure compliance with those general safety and performance requirements. So the 123 points that you find in the Annex 1 of the regulation. And that's basically the driving approach that you have for your way to conformity. To ensure conformity, you basically have to implement 4 items. If we make, let's say, a simple overview, you need to implement the quality management system. The quality management system is formalizing the way your company is operating or your organization is operating with a different procedure, how you design your product, how you develop your product, and so on and so forth. You will have to prepare a technical file. So this documentation is actually defined to characterize your product. So that's where you will find all information related to a product. So the risk management file, the usability file, the verification and validation, all the tests, etc. So all this information will be stored in a structured way. So that's typically organized through Annex 3. That's where you have Annex 2. That's where you have the requirement for the technical file. You have the clinical evaluation. So that's the clinical evaluation is formalized in a report. That's where you basically take all the clinical data you have from the literature and from your practical validation activities like clinical investigation and so on and so forth to demonstrate the device is safe and performing as expected. And then you go through the conformity assessment, which is more an action rather than an object, which is basically interacting with the notified body. It would basically take a day to go every all the topic in detail, but what I wanted to do with you, because that's really the basis you have to follow for compliance, is to work on your technical file. So let's have a look at the technical file. The technical documentation, when we look in terms of software, the technical documentation, again, it's formalized, or let's say the expectation for the technical documentation is in Annex 2 of the medical device regulation. But you need to look at it as a complete and comprehensive description of everything related to your device, meaning that that's where you will find the user requirement, that's where you will find the technical specification, that's where you will find the risk analysis that you will have done, that's where you will find the mitigation measure that you will implement in order to keep your device safe. That's where you will present the whole testing approach that you have done, the type test that you have been doing. That's also where you will include the specification for labeling and so on and so forth. So it's really the whole, it's covering all characteristics of your product, and that's those characteristics mainly that have to be leveraged to respond to the regulation. There is no particular expectation in terms of form. I mean, nowadays we don't see much paper formats, technical documentation. So the fact that you're handling that on software, on digital form is not an issue, but of course there is requirement associated with that. And what is really useful to consider is technical standards. So technical standards in the regulation, we love to talk about standards. So it's nice to say, you know, when you go for dinner with your friend that you're working on the 60304 or the 14971. But beyond that, those standards are useful because they are developed by this ISO, so International Standardization Organization, or the IEC, International Electoral Commission. And those standards are actually developed at an international level, and they are actually used in a way to support specific requirement for the regulation. So typically, when you have one of the requirements that we have seen before, so the one related on security, when I was mentioning that your device has to be cyber safe, then there is one specific requirement that we can use, which is a 62433. I'll come back to that after, which is a technical standard. Some of these standards are even considered as harmonized standard, meaning that the European Commission specifically recognized those standards to say, well, if you're developing your product according to 62304, then I consider that the requirement pertaining to software are actually correctly addressed. If you're doing your risk analysis according to 14971, then I consider that your risk management process is established as it should. So those standards are extremely useful to use. Some of them are considered well, the idea is the notion of state of the art that we have seen. So the idea, you have to develop your product in accordance with state of the art. Then you need to look what are the technical standards that you will be able to leverage in order to show that the way you implemented your product or your activity are conforming with these standards, which are by themselves representing state of the art. What is also useful to know is that most of these standards recognized by the European Union are also recognized by the FDA in the US. So typically, if you follow the principle of 62304, you not only comply with the expectation of the European framework, but you also comply with the expectation of the US framework. The principle of your technical documentation, which is extremely important. So I always have this discussion with software team. So of course, in the past, we were considering waterfall lifecycle model. And now we're thinking about agile method where we develop on the go and so on and so forth. Both worlds can be mixed. I mean, we can develop medical devices according to agile principle and so on and so forth. There is, of course, some aspect that we have to take into consideration, but it's perfectly doable. Nonetheless, you need to keep in mind the fundamental principle that is underlying all regulated activities, in particular medical devices. You have steps that you need to be able to show. And it always starts with identifying the user needs. Once you know what is the user need, then you define what are the requirements of your product, so what we call the design input. Then you have a process that generates your product, so the design process. We end up with a design output, which are typically the verification, so the product which is being developed, how we will verify, and so on and so forth, which will generate your device. And then we have verification, validation activity, which is mainly testing activity that needs to be performed. This principle, you find this principle everywhere. So you will find that with the FDA, it's a 1997 principle. So it's not something very new, but it's still there. You will find this logic in the 13485, which is the standard for quality management in the 62304. So, I mean, this logic needs to be here. You need to start with your user requirements, and you need to ensure that you have the appropriate verification and validation. It basically comes to the simple, very simple principle, which was one defined by this Mr. Deming. So probably you know this Deming wheel that some of you may know. It's really the idea that we plan. We have the first stage, the plan. So we define what needs to be done. Then we do. So we execute what was planned. We check. So we make all the verification. And then if it's not conforming, we act. It may sound very trivial, but this principle is absolutely fundamental. You cannot end up on a result without having defined priorly what you wanted. And this is particularly true for your clinical research, for instance. If you intend to do some clinical research, see what you collect and make conclusion on what you have found, this is completely wrong. That won't work. You need to establish your protocol. You need to define what are the endpoint. You need to define what are the success criteria. What are you going to measure? You run your study, you get your data, and then you assess your data according to your protocol. If you're doing just leveraging the data that you have, hoping it will work, I can tell you it won't. So this logic of planning and then doing, checking, acting is absolutely fundamental in all the activity you have with regulation. We live in a world that everything needs to be planned. We don't really like surprises at the end. This can be translated in another model that we call the V model. And again, this is really the underlying principle that we have. So it's the translation of the previous slide. So if you want, you can decompose your process in multiple stages. The first one is basically working on the user requirements. So basically the user need, what is the product doing? What do you expect to do with your device? What is the need being addressed? Then you will transfer that in the product requirements. So you will establish precisely what the software is supposed to do. Once you have defined that, you're going to technically respond to those requirements. So you're going to define an architecture, you're going to identify components, etc., that you will use, type of libraries, and so on and so forth. Then you will implement your software. You will code this software. Along each of the stage, you're going to review. So you're going to formally check that the outcome of the stage that you were anticipating has been achieved. And once you have done that, you're going to come up the other side of the V, which is basically performing all the verification and validation. So you're going to implement different level of testing and verification. So typically you're going to do code review, you're going to do unit testing, you're going to do maybe exploratory testing in some cases to check that the spec is actually achieved. Then you're going to make verification to be sure that basically the function that you plan to have are here. And at the end, the validation, the functional validation will actually demonstrate that the intent use, so basically what your device has been conceived for, is able to achieve. This model can be implemented in multiple ways. So it's soluble in agile method because you can make short cycles, but at the end, you always need to be able to have this kind of logic, starting with the user requirement, having the whole life cycle all the way down to the functional validation. This is the expectation now when you come with your technical documentation. The notified body, you will show your documentation, will say, okay, let's start with the user requirement, and we go all the way along. Keep in mind also that there is an essential process, which is the risk management process. The risk management process is there to basically ensure that the device, the way it's being designed and implemented, is done in a safe way. And this risk management process is to be followed all the way when you design your product and once your product is on the market. I come to that just after. In terms of standards, there is multiple standards, as you have understood. Maybe where do you want to start? I mean, the very interesting software to have a look for in the medical software field, you have this 62304. It's not something very new. Unfortunately, it dates, the original version is from 2006. The IEC has not been able to have the version 2.0 placed. There was no consensus around. Nonetheless, you will find the basic principle about, let's say, the good practices in software development. There is nothing really fancy here. I mean, that's basically define again this logic of how we structure requirement, the type of requirement, how we implement the design process, the fact that we have to do risk management, that we have to do maintenance, and so on and so forth. So this standard, you will actually use it to support the implementation of your design process with regard to software. It is still considered a state of the art. It's not going to bring you any technical input. So it's basically a list of requirements that tell you what you have to achieve. But the standards most of the time does not tell you how it has to be achieved. And then, of course, you have the liberty to define how you want to address those requirements. But you need to have a way which is actually valid and that you can demonstrate as being systematic, documented, and so on and so forth. The 62304 is related to the process, so the way we develop, and it's not really telling you what are the characteristics the software should have. So if you're wondering, is my software should have this kind of technology, this kind of implementation, and so on and so forth, the 62304 is not helping you. It's going to tell you basically what are the stages and the type of activity you have to implement in order to make a software which is compliant. The ISO 14971 basically characterize one of the key principles in the medical device development, which is the risk management. It's basically give you the framework on how or what you have to do to ensure that your risk management process is in place and is efficient. It's also recognized by the European Commission. That's what we call the harmonized standard. It is actually required by the 62304, so you have to use it. It's an expectation, and it will define the process and the task that you have to implement. So it basically tells you that you need to identify the different type of risk, or you need to identify the hazardous situation. You need to assess the probability. You need to assess their severity. You need to implement mitigation measure, control measure, and you need to verify that those measures are efficient. It's not providing you a tool, it's providing you principle that you have to follow and document that you have to generate. So this is something you also want to look early because when you're developing a product, risk is always one of the key characteristics you always have to consider. So if you're starting your project with regard to medical device, I would clearly invite you to go and look at this standard, because I mean, risk management is really the way you justify all decisions you will do with your device. So you cannot really expect until you reach the end of your design phase to say, okay, well, now I start to look at the risk associated with my device, because it's very likely that risk will be addressed through the risk management process, through the design. So you will actually have to take the risk measure you want to do or the risk control along with the design of your process. So it's really important that you look early to these standards. In this standard, you find different type of risk. So we are considering the notion of design risk. So typically the bugs, if my software has been coded appropriately, do I have the access to resource correctly? Do I end up in racing condition with my software, etc.? So the situation where the software can fail by itself. You also have to take into consideration the risk associated with the user. So the use errors, that's what we call usability. So at the end of the day, is my software designed in a way that enables my user to interact in a safe way? Or is there a situation where my user is not able to interact correctly? You also have to consider the clinical risk. So at the end of the day, I don't know if your software is providing input to a clinical decision, what are the risk implied by the software if the software fail, or the way the user will understand the input and so on and so forth. The security risk, as I mentioned, typically cybersec. Now, when you design a software, you need to demonstrate that it's safe with regards to prevention of malicious access and so on and so forth. And you also have the system operation risk that you have to take into consideration. Let's assume you have your software that is running on a cloud. Well, cloud normally are up 99.9% of the time, but sometimes clouds fail as well. So you need to take into consideration what happens if component of your system is actually failing while the system is in operation. So at the end of the day, this 14971 will require that you take into consideration risk associated with your device in a large scale, in all different type of dimension, and that you provide safety measure in order to reduce this risk in an efficient manner. The last standard I would like to invite you to have a look, it's the 82304, which is not yet harmonized. What is interesting with this software is basically it comes on top of the 62304, and it identifies specific requirements your software should have. So we move from the process on how to implement to specific requirement. So usually it's quite interesting when you start to think about the conception of your product, what is your product, what are the feature that your product should have, that you have a look at this standard, because it will provide you with quite some useful input. Of course, we cannot make the summary of the regulatory framework to 3 standards. So what I did here on this slide, I basically tried to see the different standard that you will have to take into consideration. So I mentioned 14971 for the risk. This is a basic requirement. You also have the ISO 13485, which is really the requirements defining for the quality management system. So how you have to implement your organization, what processes you have to implement in order to demonstrate that as a manufacturers you're performing the activities expected from medical device manufacturer. That's where you find the information. On top of those 2 standards, I mentioned the 62304, process related, the 82304, which is more related to the product. Those standards are basically giving the software layer to your medical, to your manufacturer organization. So 13485, 14971, that's for every manufacturers, whatever the type of devices. 62304, 82304 will bring the software layer in order to develop, manufacture, produce a software according to the expectation. Then we have the 3rd stage, which is really the software specific. So 62366 is really, it's not software specific in the sense it's a standard for usability, but it will look at the specifics of your product in terms of interaction with the product. So in terms of how the user is using this software. So that's a standard you also want to consider. The 62443 will be discussed more at length tomorrow by my colleague Gustavo, as it's not a standard pertaining specifically for medical device, but it's a standard pertaining to IoT security. So it gives you a framework which is considered a state of the art with regard to security for medical devices. The AAME Tier 57 is a US standard provided by the American Association of Normalization, and it gives you input on how to do risk analysis with regard to cybersecurity for software. So this is typically a document that you want to consider. And then on the last level, you have, let's say, the European regulatory specific requirement, which is the interpretation of the regulation by the European Commission through its guidance, the MDCG. So you have the 2019-11, which is providing you the classification. So that's the document we have discussed a little bit earlier in the presentation. You have the MDCG 2021, which is going to give you input with regard of the clinical evaluation. So when you have to do a clinical evaluation related to a software, then you want to have a look at this document. And you have the MDCG 2019-16, which gives you the framework with regard to cybersecurity. So when you take into consideration cybersecurity for your device, please have a look at this document because it's going to provide you a lot of information with this. Sorry for that. So what next? I've been presenting the context of regulation. We just tackle it in the first place. You will go more in depth with two topics tomorrow and the day after with cybersec and with artificial intelligence, machine learning. Nonetheless, already what we can already take into consideration with regard to compliance. The first thing when you look at your product, and we can see also that to the question, I will answer the remaining question in a minute, is first of all, you need to define precisely what is your software doing? What are your claims? And your claims are extremely important. It's basically what you're going to tell the public of your software. And the claim needs to be supported by scientific evidence. So if you say that your software does something specific, you need to prove it, either by technical mean, by clinical mean, but you need to have evidence. Knowing precisely what are the claims also enable you to decide if it's a medical device or not. If you're making a device which is actually in the wellness area, very well, that might be a very super cool software, but it's not a medical device. So you don't need to comply with every regulation. On the other hand, if you're making claims which are pertaining to the clinical field, then you are very likely to make a medical device. If you're making a medical device, the regulatory framework applies to your device. There is no exception here. You have to apply it. So then you need to be sure what is the mode of operation of your software? What is your software doing? What are the claims associated? Once this is defined, that's what we call the device description. Once the device description is well established, once you have defined what is the intended use, so what is the purpose of your software, then you can decide if you have a medical device or not, and then you can look at the classification and all the other aspects. Then what is also very important, if you go on the medical pathway, but in more general, but specifically for a medical pathway, you need to implement a software development environment and process that meets the regulatory expectations. So going back 62304, 82304, and so on and so forth, the way you develop your software, the fact that you identify the requirement, you establish the specification, so you follow this V model is absolutely fundamental because that's how you're going to demonstrate that the sequence of development of your product has been done according to the requirements. So defining how you develop your software is absolutely key here. Then you will need to implement the quality management system. If you're a medical device manufacturer, it's not only about the software you develop, it's about all the activity you have to deliver along with your software, post-market surveillance, post-market clinical follow-up, customer support, and those kind of things need to be established and documented within a system, a comprehensive system. And here again, ISO 13485 is your best friend with this. Once you have this, your product is ready. You need to go through the clinical evaluation. So you need to define early what will be your strategy. I mean, again, going back to the data, you need to collect data along to your journey to demonstrate the safety efficacy of your product. You need to plan that and plan that early because it takes time, it costs a lot of money. So you need to do that carefully in order to be as efficient as possible. Once you have finished your product, once you have performed your clinical evaluation and everything, you will compile the necessary documentation in your technical documentation, technical file. Again, that will be Annex 2 of the MDR providing you guidance on that. And once you have your technical file, which is ready, your quality management system, which is implemented, then you need to interact with a notified body in order to be able to submit your application and going through a conformity assessment. Please keep in mind that the market has changed. Notified bodies start to be scarce resources. I mean, they are completely overloaded due to change of regulation. So to some extent, if you have a medical device, I would invite you to think early of the notified body and interact with notified body because they're a little bit like super expert in the medical field. They tend not to take new clients if they are fully overloaded. So maybe it will take some time before you're able to find a notified body. So start early if it's something which is important. I have covered what I wanted to share with you today. I hope that was useful. I will take some of the remaining questions, and I will also stay a little bit longer if there is additional question. So the question I have not answered. I have one question from Joel. Does the need of a e-rep also apply in the case of a software that would be distributed in the App Store? The answer is yes. So the way you distribute your software is not relevant. It's basically the legal, I mean, the notion of having an e-rep is related to the legal responsibility. So if you're a Swiss manufacturer, you commercialize your software through the App Store. The App Store is actually European-wide. You can make restriction on the country where you want to distribute your product, but as soon as you start to place your product on the European market, then you need to have a EU representative. If I take another question, so that's Jérôme, which is providing additional inputs. Considering, for instance, LOA 4, now moving to LOA 5, impact the function of pharmaceutical industry blister. This part of the regulatory landscape, but maybe too specific for this workshop. Yeah, it is indeed a little bit too specific for the workshop, and I wouldn't be sure to answer correctly the aspect. In general, I mean, what you need to take into consideration, the products themselves are regulated very often through European regulation. But if you're considering typically for pharmacies or let's say some role of point of care and those kind of things, very often they're regulated by national rules. So I'm not exactly sure where you want to go at with this question, but I mean, the regulatory landscape, the CE marking process is really related to the product and not necessarily to the use. Typically, if you go in the genetic field with devices that are used to make sequencing on the genetic field and so on and so forth, you need to take into consideration also that there is national regulation. So not everyone, for instance, is allowed to make a genetic test. I mean, you need to have specific qualification and so on and so forth. And you may use a CE mark product, but if you're making the test, you as a medical professional, you are actually regulated by national legislation. So I'm not sure I'm responding on the right question here, but again, what is important is to look at the different legislation that may apply, because it's never only one legislation, or rarely only one legislation that apply. Moving to the next question from Boga. Hi, Kim. Thank you for this great presentation. Thank you for that. My question is, if we don't develop or use any medical device, just only serving as a web and mobile application, which regulation in place that we have to fit? Well, this is a very interesting question because, I mean, there is one regulation that you have always to take into consideration, which is the regulation associated with a liability responsibility. So typically, you always have basic regulation, and those you have at the European level, you have regulation on liability. So typically, if your product is not performing as expected and you create damage, so you're always responsible in that perspective. Of course, if your device or your web and mobile application is not regulated by any means, it may be that there is no particular regulation. Now, if you start to include artificial intelligence, we see that in Europe, artificial intelligence or machine learning system will actually be regulated through a directive. So again, I think here you need to be more specific in the intent use of your product. So what is your product doing? And once you know what are the features you provide, what are the type of function that you provide, you can easier identify what is a regulatory framework you have to follow. One thing that you really have to keep in mind when we're talking about software is processing data. In most of the case, when you're processing data which are personal data or even sensitive data, you always have the GDPR that applies, so the data on the regulation on data protection. So there is always a regulatory framework, or there is always regulatory consideration. Sometimes it's not as complete and complex as medical device regulation. Sometimes it is. So
If you're more specific, then we can go in more detail. Moving back to Kanika, what if you're simply collecting data to later build algorithm? So this is a fantastic question because it's always a question of the intent. So when you're collecting data, you always have to consider multiple frameworks. So if you're collecting data which are not related to medical field, which are not related to validation of medical devices, you're collecting general data for whatever purpose, then you clearly have the requirement related to data protection. As soon as you start to make research on human beings, so typically in Switzerland, we have the law on research on human being. If you start to collect data on human, especially if it's related to health characteristics or sensitive data, you enter the field of clinical investigation or project research. So you have legal requirements that are guiding this kind of activity. And then what is very important to keep in mind is that if you're collecting data and you don't collect your data according to the appropriate framework, and you want to use this data later to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of your product, the notified body may tell you, no, I don't accept this data because these data were not collected in a legal way. So it's absolutely fundamental. So when you define what data you're going to collect, it's very important to define why you're collecting this data, what are you going to do with this data, and then if in this data you plan to use them for regulatory purpose, it is essential that the collection of this data is done according to the appropriate framework. If you're collecting data on human use on human purpose, you can always go back to the ethical committee. So you have an ethical committee in Zurich, you have an ethical committee in Vaud, you have multiple ethical committee. You can find them actually on the web. You can always ask the question. So they're quite keen to tell you, to say, okay, you share with them your project research goal, purpose, what you're going to do as an open question, and to say, okay, do I have an ethical issue with my collection of data? Do I need to address specific requirements? And it's very likely that they will help you to say, well, there is no particular regulation on that, or there is specific regulation. So the fact that you're simply collecting data to build algorithm might not be a wild card to not consider regulation. At the end, data protection is always there, so always keep this one in mind. We have a question from Martin. A kit for precision medicine under IVD use specific equipment and consumable. I'm allowed to change equipment and consumable without losing IVD label. Well, we need to go more in the specific of this question, but a kit for precision medicine under IVD use specific equipment and consumable. It depends. It depends actually what are the requirements that you will find in the instruction for use of the IVD device, because it's possible that the IVD device restrict the use or the performance of or the claims of the kit itself to specific equipment or consumable. So when you start to use a device outside the intended use and the specified environment of use from the manufacturer, it's likely that it's not that it's illegal to do that. You can do off-label use, but then you end up being responsible of the performance and the result that you have out of the device. So you have to look at this question carefully, and the question is not a straightforward yes or a straightforward no, but I would say it really depends. And here you need to look what the manufacturer has specified, and if you go outside of the specification, then you're on your own, basically. I hope this helped. Moving to the question of Jocelyn. Jocelyn, could you please tell us once again if a software that helps adherence is a medical device or not? So don't take that as a regulatory confirmation that you can use, because you always have to consider the characteristic of the device and so on and so forth. But as a general principle, enhancing adherence in medical device, enhancing adherence with treatment by remaining the patient to take a pill, by having those kind of action is not going to be considered as a medical device. Nonetheless, depending on the function and the claim that you're doing, if you basically say that your system is improving the medical treatment, then you would have to demonstrate that you're actually improving, and there is a risk depending on how you formulate the claims that you be considered as a medical device. And that's an interesting thing with those type of device, but in general, sometimes it's just a question of wording that make you fall within the medical device regulation, and sometimes not. I mean, you may have devices that are used for, let's say, wellness, that are capturing physiological processes and so on and so forth. You use them to measure performance in sport and so on and so forth. It's no medical device. On the other hand, you may have devices that are specifically used for a medical purpose, but they are very same devices. The claim associated are within the medical field, hence you end up as a medical device. So again, when you want to decide if it's a medical device or not, usually it's not a black or white question. You really need to consider carefully the characteristic of the product and see basically what are the claims that you associate with your product. I see that it generates many questions, so it seems to either be positive or not detailed enough in the presentation. So let's take the question of Andreas. So a video management software would be considered also as a medical grade software. A video management software, no, it's not. So if it's related to the notion of PACS, because there is the notion of PACS, which is the system that use images. So a system that manage images, that store images coming from the imaging system, or which stores video that have been taken into clinic or intervention, is not a medical device. So if you go back to the criteria that you have in NICE MDCG guidance, there is a question, is your software performing an action different from storage, compression, and simple search? So, I mean, if you're just storing data is never a medical device. It's just storing data. Now, the question is always, in this video, are you doing something medical? So let's say you're filming, I don't know, a surgical procedure, and during this surgical procedure, you have algorithms that are analyzing the image, and based on the images, it gives information to the clinician, then it is a medical device. But if it's just a device to show, if it's just recording images and playing images, it's not a medical device. Return to slide 57. So I take this one from Sylvia. Can you please return to slide 57, which shows several examples of data elaboration? I'm not going to do that, sorry, unless if you precise your question, and then I can get back to you. Anyway, you can get the slide if you want in the process, if you wanted to have the example. Huh? Next question from Kanika. Who does verification? Well, that's you. That's you as a manufacturer. So that's you who organize the verification. That's you who perform the organization, the verification. You also can subcontract some of the verification to external entities. So you have test lab, you have specialized company. So at the end of the day, you decide who does the verification. At the end of the day, as a manufacturer, you're responsible for the verification, and you're responsible that the verification demonstrate that the device is safe and used as expected. Question from Bernard, with regard to property right, how much of the software coding has to be disclosed? Well, you need to consider one thing. Within the medical device regulation, there is basically, or let's say within the medical device validation process, there is no secret with regard to your notified body. So if you're interacting with a notified body, the notified body can ask you any question and you have to answer. Now the notified body is also under confidential agreement. I mean, by definition, that's part of their accreditation requirement that they have to handle confidentiality. Competent authority, when they challenge you, they also have the right to ask you whatever question they like. And you have to respond, so you cannot hide anything. So at the end of the day, if the competent authority is asking you to share the code, you have to share the code. But be aware that it's unlikely to happen. I mean, competent authority are very unlikely to look at the code itself. Notified body may ask question or look at the code. Normally, they won't really review your code. It's unlikely that they review the code. What they will check is how you have verified your code. So what you want to be sure here is to be able to demonstrate that the strategy you have implemented and the method you have implemented to respond to check your code is efficient and achieving its intention. But yes, keep in mind that I mean, when you're working in a regulated environment, especially medical device, I mean, you have to disclose at some point more or less everything to people that you should be able to trust, because normally they are under confidential agreement. But of course, it's always a quick question. So sharing your information, there is also some strategy around that, because of course you don't want to share your information. I mean, this is your own information that you have developed, which has a high value. So the strategy on how you're going to explain, present your product is also something which is fairly important. So when you structure your technical file, you need to keep in mind that you may have to show everything. Now you also need to keep in mind that the person reviewing your file has a limited time. So you also want to consider what is the structure of the information you provide, what information you provide, and so on and so forth. There are some tactics that can be leveraged here. I take the question of Nakiza, Stephanie, the question of Stephanie. What is the situation if you add a medical software to an existing medical or combination product? If the intent use stays the same, but the device can now track even through the added new software, is the regulatory path the same, including the clinical evaluation? Yes. So if this new software that you will add to the existing software, you need to define its regulatory status. So maybe it's becoming a component of the system. Maybe it's becoming an accessory of the system. Maybe it's a single standalone device. So you will have to look. And anyway, this device will have to be handled within the regulatory process. So you will have to establish a technical file. You will have to include the impact of this device in the risk management process, and so on and so forth. And if this device is providing clinical benefit, then you need to ensure that this is part of the clinical evaluation. Of course, if you add a software which is used, for instance, for maintenance, let's say you develop a software that is be connected to another device, which is a medical device, but this new software is only being used for maintenance purpose, then it's not a medical device. It's eventually an accessory to a medical device. And then since it has no clinical benefit, you may decide not to, you may not have to do this regulatory, the clinical evaluation, sorry. So the presentation will be shared indeed. So you will actually receive, at the end of the third slide, there will be a quiz. Provided you have fulfilled the quiz, you will receive the certificate of attendance, and you will receive also the slides. Question about from Scott about the IEC 8001-1 and 8 and the technical report -1-2. If I'm right, those two standards are actually being used for the validation of software, which are being used for supporting process activities. So that's what we call the IQ or QPQ. So that's basically how we validate the software which is being used typically in production. So those software are important, but they are more important that the validation of the software you may buy or you may develop for your process rather than for your medical device itself. So if you're typically using Jira for coding your software, or using another platform to manage your quality requirement and so on, you may have to validate them according to the requirement of the ISO 13485. Hence, you may have to consider this standard. Moving to the question of Henrik. In case of the pregnancy app discussed earlier, what happens if the manufacturer only claim identifying optimal time for obtaining pregnancy? No, it's not an MD. Well, under the previous regulation, it was not an MD, and actually that was a way around. Well, you can imagine that this app created an interesting regulatory challenge. And indeed, in the first place, the claim were adjusted to say, okay, this device is only helping to identify when is the ideal time to have the likelihood to generate a pregnancy. And when you're only looking at pregnancy, so then you're not within the medical device area. Now you need to take care a little bit because this topic has been widely discussed. So then I would suggest that if you're working in such an app, I would highly recommend that you basically go back in the, there is a borderline manual device that you can download. It's called a medical device borderline manual. And this case is actually being discussed, and I would start here basically to look at this. And you need to take into consideration that this borderline manual was done according to the previous legal regulatory framework. So there is quite some documents around, and you need to look in the detail. But in principle, if you're not addressing a disease, fixing an injury, and the other characteristic which are defined in the medical device class 1, in the article 1 of the, in the definition of the medical device in the MDR, then you're not having a medical device. So that's always the interesting part. And keep in mind that qualification and classification of medical device is not a science, it's a very controversial topic. So if you consider a hip implant, there is no doubt it's a medical device. When you look at software, sometimes you don't only have one answer to this question. So again, define precisely what your software does, how it operates, what are your claims associated with that. And once this is done, you can really start to decide if you have a medical device or not. Question from Daniela. Can an intent classification be discussed in early development with a notified body to make sure it will be accepted later on? I don't want to be negative with notified bodies, but in the past, we would clearly discuss with notified body when we were having a doubt. What we see now is notified body have resources, and anyway, they have to do the contract review. So notified body, when you go with your device, when you request a quote for your product, the notified body has to check that it's indeed a medical device. So if you have doubt on the classification of your product, you can always ask, well, you can ask consultant like us. You can also ask medical device manufacturer association like MedTech, Swiss MedTech. And you can also ask competent authority. You can always send an email to the competent authority asking how they position, or how you position your product. But when you will interact with your notified body, the notified body will actually verify that you have a medical device. So again, you should establish what your device does, the function, etc. And then you can request a quote to a notified body. And if they don't accept to make a contract with you, it's very likely you don't have a notified body. You don't have a medical device, sorry. Question from Max. What if I collect anonymous data? What if I collect data, anonymize it? What if I collect data, anonymize it, and throw away the key? Yeah. There is a very important to make the difference between pseudonymized data and anonymous data. So if you process data which is in anonymized form, so the identified form, but you have a key, so you're not handling anonymized key, but you're handling pseudonymized data, which are regulated by GDPR or the law on data protection in Switzerland. Now the what if, well, I don't know what is the question related, in the sense that if you use anonymous data, it always depends what is the purpose. So if you use anonymous data, if you're able to collect anonymous data directly, so not going through the process of their identification post-collection, so basically you truly collect anonymized data, then you are not under the prescription of the GDPR or the prescription of the data, the LPD, the law on data protection in Switzerland. Now, at the end of the day, the question is, what is the purpose of using this data? If you collect anonymous data to support the validation of medical device, how can you ensure that your data are relevant? If they're anonymized, you don't have the context. So it opens a large discussion behind this question, actually. Moving forward, question of Sandeep, is digital health data collection platform a medical device? Well, it depends what you're collecting. If you're just collecting data, it's basically a data patient file to some extent. So it depends what this device does. If it's providing any clinical outcome, it might be a medical device. What I would recommend here is to have a look at the MDCG guidance 2019-11, I think, and that you have the tree for classification. And if you follow the classification, this tree for classification, you might find your answer. Question from Joel. Would an app whose claim is dedicated to sport performance but is used by a doctor to monitor patient recovery be considered a medical device? No. So it's always the intended use from the manufacturer. So if you have a Garmin watch or a Sunto watch on your wrist, this watch is not a medical device. The manufacturers make no claims about medical performance. They're only collecting data for recovery and so on and so forth. If now a doctor decides to use this data to make clinical decision, he does that under his own responsibility. So the manufacturer is not impacted by this situation. What the manufacturer cannot do is place a device stating it's not a medical device and making claims around saying that you can use it in the medical context. That would be wrong. But if a doctor is using a device which is not a medical device and they use it for a clinical claim, for clinical purpose, it's what we call off-label, or it's a kind of off-label use from the user, from the doctor. Question from Yael. Are there new requirements regarding local language for labeling GUI exempt for professional user? So there is this regulation about what we call the labels, so the label that can be, so for software, when software are being provided to professional user, you can actually justify that you don't provide any instruction for use in paper form, provided some characteristic on your device. And there is also information with regard to language for labeling and graphical user interface. So there is nothing fundamentally new with the new regulation. There are some little details that have been updated. So if you're specifically working on a device, I would invite you to have a quick check on the regulation. There is also new logo symbols that have been defined in the standard. I don't remember which one. So you have to take into consideration, for instance, new symbols when you establish your instruction for use or your labeling. Good, so I think I have answered all the questions. If there is no other question, I hope this information were useful to you. I thank you very much for following this presentation, and tomorrow you will have my colleague Gustavo Hernandez talking to you about security on medical devices, and the day after, which will be Thursday, you will have my colleague Martina Pagulatu, who will present you a question related to artificial intelligence and machine learning. Have a very good day and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.